Good evening and welcome to the first of our Ian Ramsey Centre seminars in Science and Religion at the University of Oxford for Michaelmas term 2013. The title of our talk this evening is Belief Formation in the Desert of the Real. And our speaker is Dr. Olli Pekka Vainio, who is a theologian and university researcher in the Philosophical Psychology, Morality and Politics Research Unit at the University of Helsinki. His research interests include the history of ideologies and the philosophy of religion. His most recent publications include Beyond Fideism, Negotiable Religious Identities, and another book, Engaging Luther. He's a member of the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton, and he was a visiting fellow at the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at Oxford in 2012. Would you please welcome Dr. Olli Pekka Vainio. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming here this evening, and thank you especially to Andrew and Ian Ramsey Centre for their kind invitation. You all know probably Andrew, but you don't probably know the thing about Andrew, that he's an avid fan of pop culture. So especially the Transformers movies. He has seen them all, the three of them, 5 times just this month. So this partly explains the choice of my title, which is a pop culture reference, but not to Transformers, but to the Matrix. If I ever get a second invitation, I will try to do something with Transformers, but now we have to go with the Matrix. In this movie, the hero called Neo is given a choice. He's told that his beliefs about the world at large are all false. He has been living in an illusion, and now he is provided by means to wake up from this dream and experience the world as it really is. Tamine is a pill, a red pill, which Neo swallows. And then he wakes up in a sort of Cartesian vat, entering thus what is in the movie called the Desert of the Real. It's a post-apocalyptic future where evil machines control the world, and which is for humans less than ideal place to live. Now, it's an old story that reality is somehow problematic. And it is problematic even without Cartesian demons, supercomputers, and evil scientists. The gap between the representation of reality and the world itself is one of the oldest and crucial questions in the Western and also Eastern philosophy. But instead of wrestling with the big metaphysical problems, we can start with relatively mundane one. And even this can cause us serious trouble. Human belief formation is a perplexing thing, and unlike Neo, we do not have pills that could help us experience the reality without misleading mediation. This, of course, creates an interesting tension. In general, contemporary Westerners like to think themselves as critical and independent thinkers who believe only in those things that are real, proven true, and scientific. However, the scientific picture of our belief formation is very different, which is, for example, illustrated in the titles of popular books, which reflect this weird dualism between the apparent coolness of reality and our serious problems to get it right. So how we know what's really true. If we take a look at our basic belief formation procedures, it soon becomes apparent that we are not that reflective, logical, and scientific after all. For example, in a recent study by Eera Norenzayan and his colleague, they characterized 4 different causes for atheistic beliefs. So if a person scores high on an autism scale, it's very likely that he or she does not have religious beliefs. There was a talk given by Kelly James Clark on this topic some time ago, available also on YouTube. This autism Asperger type personalities do not have normally functioning cognitive skills, which makes it harder for them to attribute minds even to other persons, and this carries on to the spiritual realm as well. Second, if you are living in a secular culture or are heavily influenced by your secular peers, you tend to imitate your surroundings. You just absorb the beliefs that are around you. So you just conform what's happening. Third, some people just don't care. They are busy with other things and usually live in a post-Christian welfare state like Sweden or Finland. And finally, some people become atheists because they think that the arguments for atheism are so good, or that the arguments for theism are so bad. But this, in a global scale, is a minority position. And I think we can quite safely assume that the similar factors are behind religious beliefs and belief formation as well. Most of the time we adopt beliefs without actually thinking about the arguments. We just go with the feeling and the people around us. Now, evolution has provided us with a powerful cognitive apparatus that is able to perform huge amount of calculations in the blink of an eye. Most of the time, this system provides us with correct results, but sometimes it does not. Our system, which is mostly unconscious and beyond our voluntary control, uses a kind of program modules to perform its tasks. These are commonly called biases. The name may appear pejorative as it points to the lack of objectivity, but this simplistic reading should be avoided. Namely, biases help us to function in a fast and cost-effective manner. Most common biases urge us to choose beliefs that appear to be familiar, support our present beliefs, and require minimal amount of brain power to chew. And here I have a list of some typical biases that affect our belief formation. Now, this is a very short list. If you go to Wikipedia and look for a list of cognitive biases, you will get over 100 entries. So it's kind of very interesting and funny stuff as well. But here is a list of some of the most common and well-known biases. So first, there's a confirmation bias. So if P stands here for a belief on anything. If it confirms my previous beliefs, then we tend to believe that that's true. And if it doesn't challenge what we already believe, then it's probably true as well. And if it's simple, then it's true. And if we, meaning our group, our social peers, believe P, then again, believe is true. I mean, at this point, if there was a logician in the house, he or she would probably shoot himself, because these are all logical fallacies. And the belief perseverance bias is very interesting, because if you believe something, and I conclusively demonstrate you that the grounding of your belief is totally fabricated, you still believe that P. But there was a test done on 2 different groups. It was about whether risk takers are better firefighters than non-risk takers. And these 2 groups were given a fabricated evidence. The first group, the evidence for the first group pointed to the direction that the risk takers are better firefighters. With regard to the second group, it was totally opposite. And of course, they formed their beliefs according to the evidence. But then it was revealed to them that such studies don't exist. The whole thing is fabrication. But the beliefs of these 2 given respective groups didn't change at all, even after the closure of a fabrication of evidence. So that's the belief perseverance bias. And then there's a blind spot bias, which is typical for educated, intelligent people, people like you probably, which goes something like this, that if you invest a lot of time and energy to investigating some issues so that you become an expert on something, so then it becomes every day harder and harder for you to think that you're actually wrong. Because you have just invested so much of your time and energy for this, supporting this certain theory. So those are some of the biases which function in a way that they affect our belief formation. Now, the results of a cognitive science of religion suggest that these same processes that are in charge of our everyday beliefs also affect the religious beliefs. The obvious question is then, do we have beliefs that we should not have? The answer is quite probably we do. And this pertains to both mundane and religious beliefs. From here opens up a particular strand of debate that concerns the etiology of our beliefs and their justification. So if we are able to demonstrate how certain cognitive procedures makes it natural and easy for us to believe certain things, does this mean that these beliefs are not justified? Now, I shall not enter this field of debate, even though it's very important, but it would take us too far from the actual topic. Suffice it to say that the problems with our current versions of the so-called debunking arguments are problematic in the respect that they are too strong. If they are successful, they will undermine not only religious beliefs, but also moral and political beliefs, because they are formed by the same machinery. Also, it's virtually impossible to draw a line between beliefs that are religious and non-religious, as our beliefs are so tightly interconnected. This means that we cannot really pluck out just one belief and then use some genealogical explanation to prove that this belief is false just because it was produced by this and this cognitive module or this and this bias. Now, in this context, I think it's apt to cite a famous Oxford scholar who has pointed out that people of theological bent are often chronically incapable of distinguishing which is true from what they would like to be true. I think this person is he's onto something, but I think that he doesn't go far enough, because everyone has the same bias, the same bent, not only those who are theological. We all have worldviews that contain all kinds of stuff that's there for reasons that are beyond our conscious reach. But it's not reasonable to think that all that there is false, or that everything that we currently believe is true. Of course, the real problem is that how do we know which beliefs belong to the which category? Therefore, we need some means to find out what is really true. In recent virtue epistemology, the virtues have been invoked as a possible means to get us around some problems concerning the human knowledge. Some 40 years ago, a philosopher called Edmund Gettier published an influential paper which caused a major confusion in theory of knowledge. According to Gettier, the old definition of knowledge, that is, that knowledge is justified true belief, turned out to be deficient, because there are cases when you have justified true beliefs, but only because you were lucky. To give you an example, imagine that in hopefully not in a very near future, you are watching a North Korean military parade where they display their supposed nuclear arsenal. Looking at the close-up of a missile, you form a belief. That's a nuke right there. However, North Koreans are very cunning. The whole parade is a scam. There are no hundreds of nuclear missiles in their position, but they do have one. And this is the one that you are looking, and that's the one that is real nuclear missile. So now you have a justified true belief, but not knowledge, because you were just lucky. If you had looked any other missile, your belief would have been false. Now, these kind of situations forced philosophers to come up with more robust definitions of knowledge. In effect, this meant adding an element which is usually called anti-luck component in the definition of knowledge. This anti-luck component is meant to rule out the role of luck in belief formation, and there are several ways of doing this. One of them is to plug in cognitive virtues in the definition of knowledge, so that person's knowledge that P is caused by these virtues. In other words, the fact that, say, Susan knows that P is caused by intellectual consciousness and proper use of cognitive skills, not by luck or chance. Now, these kind of moves, however, are to a large extent merely conceptual. Nonetheless, it helped philosophers to pay more attention to how beliefs are in fact formed and how they should be formed so that they might be called knowledge. Yet some virtue theorists did not want to stay in merely conceptual level, but pushed further towards a major shift on emphasis in epistemology. Instead of definitions, epistemology as a science should make us better in knowledge acquisition. Epistemology should be able to give us guidance how we should perform in order to get in contact with the real. Within virtue epistemology, there is a branch which tries to enable just this, make us better people who know how to train themselves to believe more facts and disbelieve more falsehoods. Now, what interests me especially is whether this is actually possible. Let us assume that I'm a person who has become aware of his lack of knowledge and who wants to maximize the amount of correct beliefs about the world. Now, what should I do? Virtue theorists are likely to say that you need to start developing habits that are able to boost your knowledge acquisition. And there are several habits that are likely to increase your ability to get it right, such as wisdom, prudence, good judgment, intellectual carefulness, flexibility, thoroughness, intellectual candor, courage, apt doubt, perseverance, understanding, intellectual humility, open-mindedness, sincerity, studiousness, appropriate trust, and the like. Now, what this means is that the person who exhibits these characteristics is likely to be more efficient in knowledge acquisition than the person who lacks these virtues and who exhibits prejudice, narrow-mindedness, stubbornness, carelessness, and dishonesty. And now the million-dollar question is, where is the college that is able to teach us these aforementioned virtues and help us avoid those vices? Anyone?
New college?
Probably. Or should I say Exeter, because James is here? Yeah, okay. I won't say that it's the other place, but so you have at least two places for this. Yeah. So in the following, I will look at three different virtues: open-mindedness, humility, and wisdom, and examine the data we have regarding our ability to learn these virtues. I will first provide a short definition of these virtues and then proceed to assess how these virtues might be taught and trained. I chose these particular virtues because they are vital for healthy belief formation. Open-mindedness enables one to reach beyond what is immediately believed. Humility enables critical attitude towards what one currently believes. And wisdom offers a wider perspective that helps one to step back and evaluate the issue from the detached perspective. So first, open-mindedness. A standard definition of an open-minded person is that he or she is characteristically willing and within reasonable limits able to transcend a default cognitive standpoint in order to take up or take seriously the merits of a distinct cognitive standpoint. Now, let us unpack this a little. Open-mindedness requires a conscious act of will that lifts its holder outside the box. Due to our cognitive biases, we often have a cozy default position, but open-minded person is able to transcend this, and this requires a momentary moving beyond one's doxastic commitments. Now, as we know, sometimes open-mindedness is just defined as thinking that I hold these beliefs, but hey, I might be wrong. But this is not open-mindedness. This is just lazy thinking. Instead, this moving beyond entails here engaging a serious thought exam, which goes something like this. Even if I hold these beliefs, I will try to inhabit a different mode of thinking that is not common to me. And through this thought exam, I try to assess the possible merits of this other mode. Secondly, open-minded person engages in a dialectical deliberation where she reflects the strengths and weaknesses of both her own and opposing position. And third, open-mindedness entails that sometimes we must remain in a state of uncertainty and avoid drawing hasty conclusions. Now, in psychology, open-mindedness can be tested as an application of two distinct notions, differentiation and integration. Differentiation means an ability to apply different perspectives to a particular issue, while integration refers to a person's ability to see connections between and among those divergent perspectives. For example, we can pick a contested issue and evaluate how people are able to describe those issues. And here is an example. The case is abortion. So here I have an example of a scale where you can first see an example up there that completely lacks both differentiation and integration. And as we move down, we can see how the level of complexity increases. And here you can see the scores that in these tests are given to these definitions. The higher the score, the more open-minded the person is. Now, if this is the possibility space, where do we fall in this scale in general? And I have very bad news for you. In an extensive study by Kuhn, Amsel, and O'Loughlin on scientific thinking, they were able to distinguish three different groups which held different epistemic attitudes regarding questions like how sure people were about their beliefs, whether experts can know the truth about the matter, whether it's rational and possible to hold different views, and whether they might all be correct in some sense. First, what these scholars called absolutists hold on to their beliefs very strongly. There was just one way to skin the cat, and what they perceived as an expert opinion was held on an equal strength. The second group was called multiplists. They were of the opinion that experts can be wrong. Several theories might get it right, but we cannot really compare different theories because according to them, experiences and emotions and things like that play such a strong role in the belief formation. And the third group was called evaluative theorists, held that the several theories can be true, experts can err, they themselves might not get it right, but in spite of this, we can still evaluate and compare different theories and engage in some kind of reasonable exchange of our views and reach for the truth. In other words, the first group is some kind of a fundamentalist attitude, and just to underscore this, that this study was not about religious beliefs, it was about scientific beliefs. So it's possible to have a fundamentalist scientific attitudes. The second group is kind of a postmodern relativist position, and the last one is kind of a critical realist attitude. And the bad news, the majority of people appears to have absolutism as a default setting. And of the college students that participated in this test, only 14% were able to reach the evaluative mindset. And what's even worse, the non-college students, it was only 5%. So we are somewhere up there. So against this background, it's no wonder that reasonable conversation is often hard. I offer you another example which in this context tends to complicate things. Namely, there are several popular methods that try to cultivate us about the beliefs we hold on to and their reasonability. So everyone who follows politics or has a television knows how negative campaigning works. It attempts to poison the well, so to speak. So both sides of the debate are trying to smear the opponent in ways that are rather harsh. On the surface, this might appear as a way of helping people to think about things from another perspective, yet this is not the case. Negative campaigning makes it harder for us to trust what the other person is saying, because he or she is portrayed as dishonest or purely evil. And the one who launches a smearing campaign is portrayed in negative light as well, because he or she is not playing nice. So as a result, the actual effects of negative campaigning on the voters are very troubling, because it tends to polarize the political situation and alienate the centrist voters who will simply decline to vote at all. And this effectively radicalizes politics and makes reaching any reasonable consensus eventually impossible. Okay, so what about the training? So can we learn open-mindedness? If we focus on my side bias, it seems that if we twist their arm, people are able to consider the opposite point of view, and the effects of bias are reduced a little bit. People are generally able to produce the arguments that support their own cause, yet they are unable or unwilling to produce the arguments for the other side without any good reason. However, if poked enough, they are able to do this, but this does not take place automatically. And this kind of forcing does not really have a long-lasting influence. If this debiasing is momentary, the effects of debiasing are usually short-lived as well. And after it, people go about their lives as nothing had happened at all. Nevertheless, as already indicated, education may increase our ability to think outside the box. In a study carried out in the 80s, it was found out that it's possible to decrease my side bias among grad students, whereas education appeared not to have any effect on college or high school students. In this case, the time used for observation was very limited. But in another study, where a student participated in a 16-hour course, where several controversial issues were discussed from multiple angles, the results were more positive. When continuously instructed to take into account and engage the both sides of an argument, the students were able to come up with accounts that displayed more integration. And of all disciplines, philosophy grad students scored highest, which may reflect the nature of the discipline, which forces one to engage all kinds of arguments. And next, humility. Humility is typically defined as an ability to avoid overestimation of one's power, status, skills, gifts, knowledge, and the like. In other words, humility is a virtue that enables its holder to view oneself as one truly is. J.P. Tangney lists following key features in his definition of humility. It's an accurate and not underestimated sense of one's abilities and achievements. It's an ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, imperfections, gaps in knowledge, and limitations. It's an openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. It's about keeping one's abilities and accomplishments in perspective. It's a relatively low focus on a self and an ability to forget the self. An appreciation of the value of all things, as well as the many different ways that people and things can contribute to our world. However, what's very interesting is that humility is not typically listed among classical virtues. It is absent from the standard lists of Aristotle and Plato. And today, humility is not fashionable. Reality TV, business world, and academia that imitates both reality shows and business world are not likely to promote the culture that values humility. In addition, some psychological studies suggest that the low self-esteem causes all kinds of social and individual problems. And instead of humility, it is suggested that we need pride, which interestingly in the classical Christian literature is the very opposite of humility. So in our culture, humility is easily seen as a sign of weakness and passivity, something that results from shame and reflects pathological devaluing of the self. However, several studies demonstrate that the heightened sense of pride is linked with personality disorders and, in the worst cases, narcissism. Consequently, narcissists show higher levels of aggression, will to dominate and control over others, and many other negative features. Even if high self-esteem, in which narcissists excel, does have some benefits, the overall sum is negative. Another contemporary phenomenon is the fashionability to tout epistemic humility. But few people have actually defined what it actually means. Typically, it's taken to imply doubt about one's beliefs, but this is not a very good idea. Instead, I propose the following definition. The person is epistemically humble when she is able to articulate the strengths and weaknesses of one's own beliefs, correctly understand the strengths and weaknesses of an alien belief, and relate one's own beliefs with the alien belief in a constructive manner, which means either proper accommodation of the two ways of believing or well-argued negative response to the alien view. Now, this definition helps us to see how humility does not entail doubt or skepticism, which, however, may become reasonable option later. But I will return to this issue later in the talk. Okay, can we become more humble? The answer is that we don't really know. There are no existent reliable methods how to measure how humble people actually are, because the self-reporting is manifestly not accurate. And sometimes what appears as a humility to observers can be totally something else. Here it is worthwhile to note that different cultures have different takes on humility. Typically, Asian cultures foster a certain type of humility and modesty more than Western cultures. And this is linked to the social nature of these cultures. For example, Japanese culture is more collective compared to the American individualistic culture. And humility may also have different social functions, which can be very complex. According to British anthropologist Kate Fox, the well-known British habit of self-degradation is not that much a sign for humility, as it is a way of dealing with their own success. And as a Finn, I must note that we have this same habit as well, but it works very differently. When a Finn says something negative about himself, he actually means it. But again, this is not a sign of humility, because it's not necessarily an adequate assessment of the matter, although quite often it is. Nevertheless, there are some indirect ways to observe the aforementioned personality traits. One of them is to track the absence of narcissist traits. Another is to map out those factors that people typically refer as sources of humility in their own lives. Of course, we do not know whether these things really make people humble. This is just what they think that makes them humble. The list is as follows. First, you need reality-based feedback about one's strengths and weaknesses conveyed in an atmosphere of care and respect. You need awe-inspiring experiences, educational approaches that emphasize the limits of human knowledge, and experience of failure and disappointment. This suggests that quite a lot depends on our environment. In the case of humility, it seems that early childhood plays a central role, as a secure attachment to parents gives person means of a realistic self-evaluation in a safe context. And now it's obvious that we cannot just force people in context where they are supposed to learn humility, because people can just have a negative response. What if I don't want to wash my neighbor's feet? And if I do, this single act does not help me if it's not transformed into a way of life. Additional problem is related to the feedback. It takes character to internalize negative feedback in a way that actually helps us. And in some cases, internalizing positive feedback may be challenging too. Then wisdom. The virtue that is typically linked with old bearded men who speak like oracles, are typically absent when something bad happens and have a drive to sacrifice themselves even when it really does not make any sense. It's not very easy to give an exact definition of wisdom, yet there are several characteristics that we generally attribute to people we regard as wise. Wise people are not only intelligent, but they have a deeper skill that enables them to use their intelligence in ways that benefits others. This is why wise people are considered to be sources of advice in practical matters. Wisdom is thus not primarily related with the high level of technical skill, but an ability to apply those skills in beneficial ways in our life and conduct. It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities, Albus Dumbledore tells Harry Potter, giving thus a wise counsel how to become wise. Although empirical study of wisdom is relatively new and developing, there are tests that attempt to measure features like the ability to see the heart of the matter, and to have wide perspective that it's able to transcend one's own individual point of view and interests. Self-knowledge, that is an ability to assess own motives and behavior, including one's strengths and weaknesses. Even-handed dealing with others and otherwise consistent behavior. The methods used in this context include, for example, case studies where people are faced with challenging situations, like a phone call from a person who has decided to commit suicide. The answers given by the test subject are assessed by a panel, which is supposed to pay attention to criteria like the one above. Naturally, these assessments can be very subjective, and it's very hard to tell whether we are actually observing true wisdom, or is this person just narcissistic who knows how to push the right buttons. So there is a lot to be done. Nevertheless, there is some evidence that coping with negative life events tends to, in some cases, to strengthen the aforementioned features. Of course, a mere exposure to hardships does not make anyone wise. It is not the falling down, but getting up. So, can you teach wisdom? And it appears to be so that you can, to some extent. A social collaboration between diverse groups combined with a post hoc reflection has proved to be one possible means to train skills related to wisdom. There are currently some studies underway that try to measure whether it's possible to increase wisdom in middle school level students by making them read classic works of philosophy and literature, employing Socratic methods in teaching, and teaching familiar things from new perspective, for example, by telling the story of the founding of America from the native perspective. The results of these studies, however, are not yet in. But recently, a very interesting study demonstrated that reading literary fiction helps readers to make inferences about other people's emotions and understand their viewpoints and experiences better. Now, literary fiction was contrasted with popular fiction, non-fiction, and just reading nothing, which all resulted in a sharp difference with great literary classics. Now, reading pulp offers an emotional experience, but it does not challenge or stimulate our thinking, whereas reading Dostoevsky makes us wiser in the aforementioned sense. The reason behind this effect apparently is the complexity of the literary characters, which challenges us to think and evaluate about their motives and experiences, whereas in popular fiction everything is pretty straightforward. Now, based on this very swift overview on three virtues, we can summarize the obstacles as follows. So first, virtues are to some extent related to personality and character, which is dependent on childhood environment. Second, some virtues are inhibited by personality disorders. Third, some virtues appear to be related to hemisphere symmetry. And there's a fascinating study by Ian McGilchrist on this, a book called The Master and His Emissary, which I highly recommend. Fourth, all virtues are dependent on experience. So this is what Aristotle says, that the young person cannot be wise because he or she lacks experience. And the learning and practicing of virtues is sometimes dependent on correct and supporting environment. And many epistemic virtues create cognitive dissonance, which is an undecided state for most of us. And some institutional structures effectively block the virtuous way of life, such as in academia and the business world. So if this is the dark side, so what's the bright side? It is possible to learn virtues, although it is very hard. Our chances are better if we are in a good environment that creates ideal situation for learning by giving good examples of virtues. Of course, the problem here is that in order to learn virtues, the environment cannot be totally controlled, so that nothing bad ever happens, because it's the hard situations that teach us wisdom, if the aforementioned accounts are accurate. And starting early always helps. This was already pointed by Plato in the Republic. We need to get them while they're young. The next obvious question that follows is, does religion make it easier or harder for us to form and reform our beliefs in a ways that aforementioned virtues are manifested? However, there are several things that need to be said about this question. First, what do we mean by religion? Religion is notoriously elusive term. For example, Martin Marty offers 5 principles that characterize religion: focus on ultimate concern, community building, use of myths and symbols, performing rites and ceremonies, and demanding particular kind of behavior. But the obvious problem with this definition is that the same principles are manifested in secular politics as well. In effect, it's very hard to make a clear distinction between religious and political actions. In sociology of religion, it's customary to point out that there are different religious outlooks, which vary by context, are affected by general structure of personality, and of course have different views about life and reality in general. This makes it practically impossible to say almost anything reasonable about religion in general level. You can instead make local observations that might be valuable, but they give very little when you want to say something about religion in abstract, or even about particular religious traditions. For example, Catholics in Finland and Northern Ireland hold the same beliefs, more or less, yet they behave very differently. The last incident of violence that involved Catholics in Finland took place in 1158, when a local peasant named Lalli chased Bishop Henrik to a frozen lake and killed him with an axe, because he felt that the bishop didn't pay enough for the food that he had provided. And even this incident had not anything to do with religion as such, although different factions nowadays have varying accounts of the story. The Catholics revered Henrik as a saint and he's a patron saint of Finland, whereas the Protestant Finns, the Lutherans, regard the peasant Lalli as a forerunner of Reformation. That's 400 years before Luther. But even if we leave aside the issue of universal definition and focus on a particular religion, say Christianity, we are still faced with a plethora of problems. Do we have means to distinguish between religious and non-religious motives behind particular choices? Second, is a virtuous belief formation in religious context easier or harder compared to what? Now, third, do we have means to control the effect of personality or some other contingent factors? These questions are typically presented and acknowledged in research literature, and then reader is often met with dictums like this may point to, this might indicate, and there is so much we don't know. At the moment, the question in its current form is too big and has too many factors we cannot control. Most we can do is to say that the worldview A, if it's held in political and sociological situation B, by a group of having general characteristics C, may have unwanted consequences D. But you cannot sell books with this. So instead of religion poisons everything, more scientifically accurate subtitle would be, for example, something like this. Certain factions of Islam, for example, if feeling threatened and harassed by an outside force, and if large enough constituency within this faction has a personality type that makes it easy for them to experience unpleasant emotions, may poison something. So, in spite of this lack of accurate generalizations, it is often claimed that certain characteristics of some religious styles may infringe the biasing. And let us examine one critical point that is sometimes made in this context. Namely, when people act in clearly defined groups and identify themselves with them, certain biases increase in-group, out-group distinction. This means that the beliefs of in-group are constantly strengthened through exposition to data that comes from within the own group. Simultaneously, the out-group is viewed with suspicion and their criticisms are not taken seriously. This is something that we can see happening in politics all the time. And incidentally, we do have quite a lot of research on this, how this plays out in partisan politics. Now, based on the fact or theory that religiosity correlates with community building, we could claim that strong in-group favoritism makes it harder for religious persons to be open-minded towards other theories than their own, hinder epistemically humble attitudes, and prevent wide perspectives necessary for practical wisdom. Of course, we know that sometimes exactly something like this does happen every now and then. But this is not unique to religious cases. Nationalism can boost similar attitudes and causes a lot more problems than religion in global scale. Also, in-group favoritism is strengthened when a group is threatened, which again is a common human reaction. And I just assume that in UK these biases are triggered more often by football than religion. But I suspect that there are no studies about this, because it's not very easy to get funding for a study that attempts to show how football poisons everything. Another interesting phenomenon in this respect is called moral self-licensing, which means that if you are able to perform certain virtues, you easily forget that those were not the only virtues you should pay attention to. In a very interesting study, it was demonstrated that people who buy green products are more likely to cheat, lie, and perform other shady stuff compared to non-green consumers. So going green makes you mean. Quite likely this same effect can be manifested in religious communities, which can be very selective in virtues that they choose to espouse. Yet again, the problem of moral self-licensing is not related to religiosity as such. At this point, someone can try to argue that religions are somehow worse off than other belief systems. But as already noted, this is very convoluted since we do not have religion as such, which we could remove from all particularities. It is not only that we have very little empirical research on this, but also that the research quickly runs into severe conceptual troubles if it tries to focus on some particular case, which makes drawing general conclusions naturally very hard. And all we can say that sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. The research on this topic, which is, as I said, very scant, usually approaches this issue from negative angle, how bad religions are. And I've tried to find any studies that could say something positive about this, or approach this thing from a positive viewpoint, asking, does religiosity give you epistemic advantage? Does religiosity make one more conscientious in knowledge acquisition? As you can imagine, this thing is not very well researched. There was, however, one study that touched these issues and which results were very interesting. Anthropologist John Shields observed and analyzed various Christian right organizations in America, especially those involved in abortion debates. Shields, who identifies himself as a liberal Protestant and does not share the beliefs of a Christian right, argues that contrary to the widely held beliefs according to which Christian right is the movement that endangers the foundations of American democracy, it's the first and foremost Christian right that has been able to mobilize a marginalized minority, challenge mainstream consciousness, and raise the level of debate on matters such as what's the definition of human person and what's the ontological basis for human dignity, which ironically are traditionally the goals associated with the left. Now, Shields argues that of all contemporary movements, at least in America, it is those that are associated with the Christian right that teach their members central democratic deliberative norms and quite effectively controls that these norms are maintained in their public appearances. And now these forms include the following. First, the practice of civility and respect, the cultivation of real dialogue by listening and asking questions, rejection of appeals to theology, the practice of careful moral reasoning, and fifth, openness to alternative points of view. In his field study, Shields found out that the first 4 norms are promoted and practiced far more than we are usually led to believe. However, there's a twist. The 5th norm, which is often included among the aforementioned norms and political virtues by political scientists, is not widely and explicitly encouraged, although there are exceptions. For example, pro-life activists can say that they are willing to change their minds if they are given a good argument that demonstrates that there is a fundamental difference between a fetus and a newborn child. And this was contrasted with the pro-choice organizations like Planned Parenthood's guidebook statements according to which they do not engage in dialogue with pro-life groups because abortion is a basic human right and therefore should not be open to debate or negotiation. Now, according to Shields' study, we have some reason to believe that in some contexts, conservative Christian beliefs can foster epistemic and democratic values, at least when compared to the certain opposing groups. And these values can be universally recognized, even if the moral values behind them and in question are not universally shared. The potential problem that is related to the 5th deliberative norm, the open-mindedness, needs to be addressed. Now, there are several political theorists who advocate skeptical attitudes in complicated public matters. According to these views, we should hold our beliefs tentatively and entertain real possibility that we can be wrong. And the problem of many groups is that they are so sure about their views, which, according to theorists, is not a good thing. So, how should we perceive the discrepancy between the first 4 norms and the 5th? Now, I think it's quite obvious that in order to further a public cause, no matter what it is or how we perceive its value, we simply need to sustain a relatively high level of certainty in order to act in the first place. Now, if we are skeptical, we will do nothing and status quo prevails. And if people act, they will act with confidence, and there should be nothing wrong about that, if they are able to live according to the first 4 norms. Even if they are not willing to admit that they might actually be wrong, they can still show open-mindedness by promoting civilized culture of conversation, which in principle may lead to a belief revision at some point later. So we do not need to expect that the conversation will lead to a consensus, since a minor goal, namely more accurate understanding, can be viewed as a desirable thing as such. Secondly, psychologists have noted how skepticism may have some unwanted consequences. The problem about doubt is that if we come to hold beliefs or convictions in a way that leaves us doubtful, we feel less satisfied and more stressed as our working memory keeps on checking for other alternatives. And this has serious consequences for our identity. Now, if we choose, as we sometimes do, to keep our options open, we are setting ourselves on a shaky ground. Having a set of beliefs that are unstable is something that makes us easily dissatisfied and regretful. And it seems that being uncertain just is not very easy or natural for human beings. The third problem is that it's not very reasonable to believe that all sides of the debate are willing to lower their levels of certitude, especially in cases when it's a priori ruled out as an option, or when one group is empowered and the other is not. It would be very nice if there were a no man's land where we could move during the disputations, but often there is not. Therefore, the basic nature of human disagreements makes it unreasonable to expect that we could have all the nice things and all the virtues at the same time. So we are going to disagree anyway. The interesting question is, how are we able to live through our disagreements? Now, Schill's analysis of deliberative norms is illustrative regarding the virtue discourse in general. It is often pointed out that religions have this strange dualism. On the one hand, they preach universal love, but on the other hand, they tend to be very group-minded. But of course, you cannot make a claim about universal love or argument about dignity of a human being except from and through a tradition. If this tradition ceases to exist, so does its claims. We are balancing between the extremes, and dealing with balancing and finding the golden mean is what in Aristotelian tradition is called phronesis, the practical wisdom. To conclude, can we become more conscientious in our belief formation? Yes, but it's very hard and often dependent on factors beyond our immediate control. The virtues I mentioned in passing and those which we investigated a bit more thoroughly can be reasonably considered as character traits or similar features that more likely than not will take us closer to truth, although the road is long and winding. Now, before I end, let me go back to the title of my talk. As a well-known Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek notes in his book Desert of the Real, how Marxist philosophy had become almost pathologically interested in the real, which in their case was manifested in doublespeak, staged court sessions, and monstrous violence. If what we are now experiencing wasn't real, the real was behind this world, the existence, and had to be summoned with the help of acts that transgressed with our mundane life and norms. And in the end, it became apparent that this passion for the real was itself a dream that led people further away from the actual human existence. Now, it is evident that virtues are not like the red pill in the Matrix that enables us to experience truth in an unmediated form. Instead, virtues offer us a more human and more excellent way that is in accord with our nature, a slow closure, a journey through the desert towards the real. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vainio. We have up to half an hour for questions, and if you'd like to wait until Dr. Silva comes around to you, then we can also catch your questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right, my question is simple. Is there any other pathway to humility or to wisdom other than that of a brutal ascetic endeavour in its broadest sense?
So is there any other way to wisdom except asceticism?
That's correct, basically, in its broadest way, yes, in its broadest form.
Well, let's go. I think it's, well, if we assume that it's actually possible to learn wisdom, so I don't think that you need negative or kind of harsh experience of learning wisdom. I mean, thinking about examples. I mean, think about being a father, for example. I mean, being a father involves also some negative or a kind of stressing moments. But if we could just, we can take the sort of good, sort of hilarious, funny moments, and they can give you some kind of angle to reality that makes you wiser. But overall, I would think that you sort of need the both sides in a proper relation.
I was thinking specifically perhaps of the great saints of the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the starets of Russia and so on, who were regarded as the wisest people in their society, but of course their pathway was one of fairly rigorous ascetic endeavour and a lot of pain and suffering on that way.
That's a very, very good point, because I come from a Lutheran tradition, and the Reformers, and at least Luther, didn't have a very high opinion of monastic life. I mean, I grant that he went a little bit overboard in his criticisms. But there is for example, I mean, going back to the idea of being a father, he has a small book on marriage, where he contrasts the married life to monastic life. And he says that actually going to monastery is not going to help you becoming humble and wiser, because it just makes you revert on your self-righteousness, and you are relieved from all the actual problems and hardships that are in the world. Whereas the greatest way of sanctification is being not able to sleep because your son is sick, washing the diapers, and consoling the mother, and things like that.
Yes, I think it's not one pathway being superior than the other. I mean, Gregor of Nyssa said it's actually the same as you state in that respect.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the asceticism can also manifest itself in that other pathway, the pathway of marriage, which is exactly what you're saying, really. Yes,
and you can actually go wrong with the reverence of a married life, so that there are. I mean, the thing with virtues is that you can mess up everything. So because it's being virtuous about finding the golden mean, so that you can live a normal family life and go wrong with it. You can go to monastery and do it wrong. So.
Thank you very much for your talk. I greatly enjoyed it. I have a question considering the virtue of open-mindedness.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you can go to that slide specifically. I'm wondering if open-mindedness as a virtue assumes a specific virtue of, say, conviction or confidence in one's working beliefs. I remember Chesterton said that the purpose of an open mind, like an open mouth, is to close on something solid.
Yeah.
And one can often find that people are so, in a sense, open-minded that they're closed-minded to anyone ever having any convictions.
No.
So I'm wondering if this open-mindedness, in which it says able to transcend a default cognitive standpoint, is that one still has to have enough confidence in that cognitive standpoint. And this might relate to your notion of your reference to Aristotle's idea of the golden mean.
Yeah, exactly. So, I made this comment about this common definition of open-mindedness, that, hey, I just might be wrong. I mean, that sort of betrays an attitude that this person doesn't actually believe what he claims to believe in. So that being actually and virtuously open-minded, you need to have some kind of confidence into your into your beliefs, and you need to also be safe, because this feeling of safety is I mean, when we have investigated situations where there is lots of disagreements between different groups. So and they try to come in terms with each other. So if there is not enough feeling of safety, it's going to go wrong. So yes, I mean, yeah, I can affirm what you are saying. So, but if you want to follow up on that, so
Just a last follow-up question would be, where do you think the limits are of open-mindedness where it can default to relativism? Like, I remember Groucho Marx said, "I have my principles, but if you don't like them, I have others."
yeah.
You know, where it defaults to a certain inauthenticity or insincerity,
Yeah.
or maybe I should say a lack of integrity in one's own beliefs. Where do you think that limit is?
Well, it's very hard to give any general answer. So, I mean, one very interesting question in this respect is that if we think that open-mindedness is a Christian virtue, so does open-mindedness enable that it would be a virtuous thing for a Christian to give up his Christian beliefs? Sort of going so far in this open-mindedness. Because that's behind the criticisms made by these political theorists who criticize certain groups for being too sure, and also it's behind certain new atheist critiques of religion that like for example Daniel Dennett says in the Breaking the Spell that religions, I mean, that's quite weird generalization again, but they don't have any means of self-criticism, which is manifestly wrong. But what's behind this comment is something that he would like to probably see something like this, that if religions would be virtues in the sense that he wants them to be, they would actually have this kind of idea of open-mindedness that they could somehow negate themselves. But it's, I mean, no one has this kind of, there is no belief system in a human existence that has this kind of self-destruct method. So, but of course, it happens that some people go, they are maybe open-minded, and then they end up changing their beliefs. And that's a sort of descriptive fact that it happens. But we need to go case by case whether this incident of belief revision was actually virtuous or not. So we cannot discuss that on a general level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You parallel political views with religious views, and maybe the parallelism work to a certain point. However, I think there is one particular case which doesn't apply to politics, and that is, in religious context, that is personal revelation. And sometimes it happens that, so personal experience, that shortcuts all the ways, all these, and after such an encounter, people become virtuous without being taught, it just happened. And it's quantifiable. I mean, you can, not quantifiable, but it's manifest, it's visible, because that person behaves differently after that. And sometimes happen to groups. So there is a kind of, you can build around this, and you can make the difference between political conviction and religious clear.
No. Yeah, I mean, you're correct. If I mean, in sociology of religion, it's manifested that if a person has extrinsic religiosity, which is not kind of very personal, if it's internalized through a conversion experience or something like that, then this person starts to manifest more certain type of virtues. And so, I mean, religious conversion helps to exhibit certain virtues. That's true.
Politician might not have them. I don't know any politician who has political revelation. It might be, I don't know, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's. I mean, Yeah, well,
There-
yes, several interesting things pop into my mind, but it would take us too far left field if we would start discussing politics. So, but it's Helen.
So when you mentioned the fact that our environment is so important in overcoming these biases, I didn't just think about the environment as a way to help us become more epistemically virtuous, but also the fact of communicating with others can help overcome biases. So you have
Yes,
this research by, Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier saying that people have this confirmation bias, and in effect that sort of when you are in a group you notice that you have it and that sort of thing. So I thought that in your question about does religion make it better or worse, one might say if you are, in a group of very like-minded people, you're less likely to spot, the bias blind spot to your biases, because you just talk to that is the thing with religion and with many other things like politics as well, but you tend to associate with people from your in-group. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean that's definitely true, and also there's you probably know this paper by is it Paul Draper on bias in philosophy.
I'm just not very sure how far it's worse than in other fields. I know the paper.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, just for the rest of you, there's a paper that has raised some discussion on whether philosophy of religion as a discipline is biased towards theism, because there are so many theists doing philosophy of religion, and they tend to confirm their previous beliefs. But I mean, you can go and read the paper and think for yourselves. But exactly what I was thinking about reading. I mean, this happens. The same biases are functioning everywhere. But in the end of Draper's paper, he has some suggestions. What would make maybe philosophy of religion more interesting is that we would have more people from different perspectives. And in a way, this already happens in philosophy conferences, that there are theists and atheists sitting on the same table. And my own experience is it's extremely refreshing to have agnostics, atheists, and theists and discussing the same argument, and you have atheists who are helping theists to make their case for theism better, and other way around. And well, this is within the discipline of philosophy of religion, but also, I mean, when we are dealing with all kinds of religious disagreements, I mean, political disagreements, it's, I mean, there's a recent fascinating study by Jonathan Haidt. I mean, the studies themselves, they are old, but he just published a very fun and interesting book called, can you remember the title? Why Good People Disagree in Politics and Religion. A Righteous Mind. The Righteous Mind is the title of the book. And he goes through a series of studies in moral psychology and partisan politics in the United States. And he observes that there is this strengthening of this kind of very polarized politics, and well, what we have just seen with the government shutdown and everything, that people are not talking to each other. And there are certain very material and practical matters behind this. For example, not that many years ago, the party leaders in America gave an suggestion that the members of Congress live in their home states instead of Washington, D.C. Whereas before, the old politicians, they would play golf in the same field, their children would go to the same school, they would sit in the same parents' meetings, and they would share the same living space. And Democrats and Republicans would talk to each other more in their normal lives. But this is not happening anymore. So there is no common table where they could sit, and this manifests as a polarization, which can lead to maybe kind of absurd sort of things. So, yeah. Did I answer at all? So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a quick question about the belief perseverance bias. It's a very interesting list of biases, and particularly the story about the firefighters and two groups being given different kinds of beliefs and then holding on to them, even when they're shown to be false. The question I have is, how were those beliefs first inculcated? Because I can imagine two different ways of doing it. One of which you sort of give statistics of personality types and success in fighting fires or whatever.
No.
So you could give it what you might call a left brain analysis.
No.
Or you could do you could tell stories
No.
of courageous, bold firefighters. I wonder which kinds of beliefs are most sticky, in the sense that they're held more tenaciously, even in the face of contradictory evidence. As you can see, you probably guess, I'm interested in that McGilchrist distinction.
Yes, yes.
And which beliefs are more sticky, the left ones or the right ones?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on whether the person is a left or right brainer. So I would assume that if a person who is given this evidence leans on to the left side, if he or she is given kind of right side evidence, it doesn't just nothing happens there. But if he's given kind of a left brain evidence, this is just an assumption that I would think it would go something like this. Yeah. But I think we can assume that no one has investigated that, but it should be investigated. Yes. Maybe we should apply money from Templeton to.
Excellent idea. Excellent idea. Yes. John?
Thank you. Something I've often wondered about. It's generally believed that our lives are shaped by our genes and the environment. But our moral choices a third element? Or not really? It's just one or the other.
I mean, well, it is third, and I think there are more.
Even more?
Yeah. I mean, I was just before I came here, I was reading Christian Smith's book, Moral Believing Animals. And he has a very interesting new book, came out not that long ago, called What is a Person? And he traces out all kinds of different things that actually have some bearing on our beliefs and on our conduct. And there are moral choices, there are institutions.
But would institutions will be part of the environment?
Yes. In a way, yes. But yeah, I'm trying to figure out. So you said that there are genes. What were the
genes, environment,
and
moral
choices? Yes. Okay, so if we go for a minimal route, then we could say that there are those three, and of course it's. We don't even have to go on debating free will and anything like that, but I think it's pretty obvious that how we live our lives shape how we are going to live our lives in the future. And going for a kind of a very, I mean, there is in virtue literature there is a debate on whether this is a reasonable endeavor. The people like Gilbert Harman and the situationists say that the effect of environment and genes is so strong that we shouldn't talk about these virtues at all, because it's some kind of it smells politically bad and maybe a kind of a right-wing thing that people should just take care of their lives by themselves, whereas the real problems are in structures that are oppressive, that when we change the structures then everything turns out fine. But I think that doesn't sound very reasonable, because if we are going to change structures, only way to change them is to have moral convictions and make moral choices that in the end may change our environment. So,
I'd just like to follow up on that by asking, is it time to move past simply saying environment as a whole, because obviously some parts of the environment will be singularly important in affecting the decisions that are made and the character development, and others may not matter. Also, with some people, certain parts of the environment will matter more than others.
Yes.
So don't we need to move beyond that and begin to look, for example, at, as you mentioned in one of your slides, the influence of the peer group?
Yeah.
We probably should go and move on to things like the particular society influences. Certain things that are important to people growing up in England don't matter to people growing up in America or in Denmark or in Germany, and so on.
Yeah.
And then we could even talk about what you might loosely call the spirit of the age. Things that matter to us in the 21st century didn't really matter to people in the 19th century, and vice versa.
No.
So when do we move beyond just using this big bucket, the environment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's always a problem when we use a concept like environment, because it's and when we contrasted it with maybe our choices, and because I mean, what our environment consists of, it consists of choices. So if we live a family life, what we observe in our immediate environment is the choices that people make. Am I going to spend time with my son, or I'm going to play Xbox, or go to movies with my friend, or I mean, it's what environment is. It's just a kind of collection of choices. And
sometimes it's not our choices.
Yes.
For example,
Yes.
I get sent to a school as a child.
No.
Somebody assigns me to a class. I just happen to have a teacher, an English teacher, biology teacher, whatever he is, or she is, that really inspires me, or catches my imagination, or does something, or says something that really gets in my head.
No.
None of my choices, not one of them.
No. Yeah,
And yet they changed me. They
yes.
followed me forever.
Yes. That's true, and yeah. But when something is going to change in particular branch of science, no one really can tell. But I mean, in sociology of religion and in sociological study, I mean, Christian Smith has been trying to push this kind of new understanding of human personhood that is more, I would say, more in line with the humanistic and also theological understanding of human nature.
I'd like to make one final brief comment, because something you said about Plato and Aristotle not talking about humility, and that's certainly true of Aristotle completely, and it's almost completely true of Plato as well.
No.
But there's one reference that's almost no one knows about, so I hope you don't mind me mentioning it, because it's a very interesting one. It's one in his last work. So in the Laws, book 10, he mentions humility. It's a very interesting idea. He says that if you lose humility, you cease to be a friend of God, and you then lead your city to ruin.
No.
So it's a very, very. But what's interesting is the theistic reference, but also the reference to friendship, and that humility enables friendship. And you can't be friends with a proud person. So I think it's very interesting at the very end of Plato's life. He seems to have this referent idea of, which was seen in the early church, kind of prefigurement of a Christian idea of virtue. But just mention that.
Maybe it's just an illustration of how long does it take for a person to get into down there.
Yes.
So that for Plato, it's just before he dies.
The end of the life. Yes. Yes. Well. Just before we conclude the talk, I just got a couple of other very brief announcements. So our next talk here will be in 2 weeks' time, and our very own Dr. Nacio Silva will be talking about the conclusion of a 3-year project, Science and Religion in Latin America, which has been quite hair-raising sometimes, and also extremely fruitful. And so that will be in 2 weeks' time here. And also, I've been asked to make another announcement, because if you get bored on the Thursdays where we're not giving talks here, there's actually Brooks Union Oxford Books Union. I think there's several people here from Oxford Books, and they're actually offering talks at 6 o'clock on the other Thursdays when we don't have talks. There's one on the 14th of November on Buddhism, 21st November on feminist perspectives on the economy, and 28th of November, Lord Robert May of Oxford will be giving a talk, and you can find the details on Brooks at brooksunion.co.uk. And the talks will be at 6 o'clock. It only remains for me to invite you to join me in thanking Dr. Vainio for a very interesting talk.